Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and this weekend, I should say, it's December 3rd, first Sunday of Advent. This weekend I've been working on an assignment that I've got for a course that I'm taking, a Constitution course at Harvard, and I had an assignment to work on, my third assignment of the term, and we had to select one of the men involved in the development of the Constitution, and we had to do a biographical sketch of that individual. And I'm really not a big fan of American history. I've never been interested in it, but as I worked on some of my other assignments for the course, I ran into a couple of names that attracted my interest. One of them was Daniel Carroll, and the other was Thomas Fitzsimmons. And the reason why I was attracted to these two men was because I learned that both of them had signed the Constitution, and they were both Catholics. So, I've been interested for a long time in understanding what the Catholic Church had to say while America was developing as an independent country. And so this whole question of Catholics involved in the founding of the American government and even in the production of the Constitution was really interesting to me. So over the past few weeks, in the time that I've had with all my teaching and stuff, not too much, but I've been researching and studying the life of Daniel Carroll, and tonight I finished up a draft of my paper, and I found the study so interesting and found this man so admirable that before I, dig in and finish this project tonight, putting in some late hours, I thought I would just do a talk and share what I've learned because I think it's really, really great. So first of all, like I said, the subject, the man who I'm studying is Daniel Carroll. And Daniel Carroll lived in Maryland. He was born in 1730. And it's hard to keep all these dates in mind, but it's important because this is such an important period of history in the Catholic Church and in America, which for us American Catholics, we don't really get too much patriotic American history from a Catholic perspective. But Maryland was founded around 1630. There was a man named George Calvert who was an Anglican revert to Catholicism who obtained a charter, and his son, he died at the time, and his son, with the help of the Jesuits, so keep your attention on the Jesuits as we go through this. His son, George Calvert's son, and some Jesuits actually established the province of Maryland. And it was intended to be a place that would be something of a haven for Catholics, because obviously the Northeast was anti-Catholic, the South was largely anti-Catholic. But Maryland was going to be a place where Catholics could live safely and practice the faith. Well, that was in the 1630s. As the province developed, in the 1690s, the assembly that governed Maryland was controlled by Anglicans, and they established Anglicanism as the official religion of the state of Maryland. So all of a sudden, Maryland was a state that no longer welcomed the Catholic faith and persecuted it. Catholic men were not allowed to hold public office. Catholic priests were not allowed to minister or fulfill many parts of their ministry publicly. Children were not allowed to receive Catholic education, and Catholics were even made to pay higher taxes than non-Catholics in the state of Maryland. So life in Maryland was pretty rough, and the Jesuits had to sort of go undercover because most of their activity, education, evangelization, that stuff was not allowed in Maryland at the time. So it was around that time that Daniel Carroll was born, 1730. Daniel Carroll was born to a wealthy family, a wealthy Catholic family living in Maryland. And there's a funny story, or a funny history, I should say, because there were actually two different Carroll families who came to Maryland, separate families, both last name Carroll, and they intermarried. And the men and women in the families had the same first names. So we get these really interesting genealogies. For example, Daniel Carroll, right, the subject of the paper that I'm writing here. Daniel Carroll's father's name was Daniel Carroll. Daniel Carroll married a woman, and her father's name was also Daniel Carroll, and Daniel Carroll's son's name was Daniel Carroll. So you had the father was Daniel Carroll, the father-in-law was Daniel Carroll, the main character is Daniel Carroll, and his son was Daniel Carroll. So all of these Daniel Carrolls. So you can imagine what a mess this is to figure out historically with four men all with the same name. In addition to that, Daniel Carroll's mother's name was Eleanor Carroll, and he married a woman named, guess what? Eleanor Carroll. That wasn't her married name, that was her maiden name. So both his mother and his wife were named Eleanor Carroll. So it's just a funny family story as these two Carroll families come and settle in Maryland and then intermarry, and they've got all these common names. But they were a wealthy. Daniel's family was wealthy and aristocratic and very well connected in Maryland, and he was born into a wealthy Catholic family that was living in a place where their Catholic faith wasn't tolerated. They had to sort of keep it undercover. So for Daniel, when he was, after he was born, he was homeschooled by his mother Eleanor for the first, nursery years of his life. She was the primary educator of her child. And then once he got to the age where grammar studies should begin, he started to receive instruction pretty privately from the Jesuits. They began directing his classical studies because he was going to be given a full-blown classical Catholic education. So the Jesuits gave him his grammar instruction and prepared him to go to college. When he was 12 years old in 1742, Daniel Carroll was sent overseas to the very northern tip of France to an area called Flanders, and it was there that there was a Jesuit college, an English Jesuit college named St. Omer College, O-M-E-R. And Daniel Carroll was there from 1742 to 1748, so from years 12 to 18, for his core classical Catholic education. And there he studied, the program of studies that we read of in the Ratio Studiorum, which, I always talk about. If you're interested in the Ratio Studiorum, you can just go to the Classical Liberal Arts Academy website and search for it, and you'll see a copy of it there translated into English. But that was the curriculum that he studied, this famous American man. So in Flanders, in northern France, he received a classical Catholic education according to the Ratio Studiorum from the English Jesuits at St. Omer College. And at age 18, he came home, back to America. And that was the end of his formal education. Now what's more important about this Daniel Carroll is his brother. His brother was John Carroll. He was born 5 years after Daniel, so 1735, and he went through the same education, so all the same advantages, great family, wealthy living conditions, but persecuted Catholic faith, received elementary instruction from the Jesuits, and was then sent to Europe for his Jesuit education. At age 18, however, John Carroll, the younger brother, when he came to the end of his studies, decided that he wanted to become a Jesuit. So he joined the Jesuits, and he continued studying philosophy and theology and was eventually ordained to the priesthood when he was 26 years old. So that's around, he was born in 35, so 26 would be like 1761. So John Carroll becomes a Jesuit and is ordained a Catholic priest, 1761. Pay attention to the dates here. So Daniel is back home. He went back home in 1748. We're now talking about 1761. John is in Europe. Well, he's a Jesuit priest in Europe in 1761. 12 years later, the Pope, I forget which Pope it was. Actually, I might have it right in front of me here. No, I don't. Pope. Was there a Pope Nicholas? Let me check. I've got notes right here. 1 second. It's kind of important. I think it was Pope Nicholas the 14th, but I'm not sure. You could check me on that. But anyway, 1773, at that time, the Jesuit order was suppressed. So John Carroll all of a sudden had the vocational rug pulled out from under him. He was no longer a Jesuit. He was ordained a priest, but he was no longer a Jesuit. So he went back to America. This is John Carroll. He went back to America in 1773. We'll come back to him later. So getting back to Daniel, he came home in 1748. 1751, his father, Daniel Carroll I, died and left him everything. So he inherited his father's business and tons of land. He was a very wealthy man. And from 1751 until 1777, Daniel Carroll worked just managing his father's land and his merchant business, and became very successful and became one of the most prominent men in Maryland. In 1777, Daniel, I should also say he was married in 1763 to Eleanor Carroll, and they had 2 kids, but Eleanor died pretty young. I think she was, I forget the year, but anyway, she died young. He had 2 children and did not remarry, and then just devoted his whole life to business and what would become a political career. So Daniel Carroll in 1777 gets elected as a councilman in the state of Maryland. He becomes a Maryland state council member. And so he serves in this capacity as a councilman from 1777 until 1781. So he's reelected like 4 times, and he serves for 5 years. And his job as councilman during that time, this is during the Revolutionary War, so life is very difficult for them at this time. They're trying to come up with recruits for the army. They're trying to find supplies for the soldiers. The soldiers really lacked everything. They didn't have food or clothing. So Daniel Carroll had to use all of his business acumen, all of his connections through his merchant business, just to try to locate supplies for the Maryland troops that were in the army and the American troops at large. So he continued in that until 1781, because in 1781 he was appointed to go to Philadelphia to become to serve as a delegate of the state of Maryland in the Confederate Congress. Don't get this confused with, the modern U.S. Congress or the Constitution. This is before that. This is 1781. In 1781, Daniel Carroll leaves Maryland and goes to Philadelphia. When he's there, he signs the Articles of Confederation. So he is a Catholic signer of the Articles of Confederation, which was really like the first Constitution of the United States in 1781. So he puts a Catholic signature on the Articles of Confederation, which is really fascinating when you consider how anti-Catholic America was at the time. So he signs the Articles of Confederation, and then during the Revolutionary War, as a member of that Congress, he spends his whole time trying to help the military, support the troops, gather resources, get money to pay the soldiers and stuff like that. And And it's this miserable time because the Articles of Confederation didn't give the central government any power. So there was a Congress that gathered these delegates from the colonies, but they just had no power. They couldn't tax, they had no money, they had no power to do anything. And the weakness of that initial government was made manifest by the problems of the Revolutionary War, and Daniel Carroll was at the center of that. So in 1783, he finished serving his time on the Confederate Congress and went back to Maryland, 1783, and went back and served as a state senator from 1781 to 1790, so 2 terms as a state senator. After, even while he was serving in the Confederate Congress. So he got back to Maryland, and then 1787, he's appointed delegate for another Congress, and this is actually the Constitutional Congress. So he's sent back to Philadelphia to be a part of the discussion and debate to draft the Constitution of the United States. Now, the Constitution was seen as necessary because the Articles of Confederation were proven to be so useless during a time of emergency. So if anyone knew of that weakness of the government, it was Daniel Carroll, this Catholic representative from Maryland. So he was sent back to Philadelphia, participated in the debates of the Constitution, and became one of several Catholic men, Catholic Americans, to sign the Constitution. So he signed both the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, which is really amazing if you think about it. I think he was the only one to sign both of them. So the 2 forms of government that were established in early America, this Catholic man, Daniel Carroll, signed both of them. Okay? And in 1787, he then had to return back to Maryland because he had to lead the state government in Maryland to accept the Constitution, because 9 of the 13 colonies had to accept it in order for it to be ratified. So he went back to Maryland to try and persuade the people of Maryland to accept the Constitution. And it's worth noting, because sometimes we wonder about this, like, what did Catholics think about the Constitution? And Daniel Carroll, who was a classically educated, faithful Catholic man, said that the Constitution was the best form of government ever given to men. That was the opinion of a classically educated, Jesuit-influenced Catholic living in America in 1789. I think that's interesting to know, that to a Catholic, the Constitution was considered an excellent form of government. And of course, he signed it, and then went and argued in Maryland to get his fellow Maryland citizens to support it, and for the state government to actually accept it. He succeeded in that, and during this time, he's corresponding with James Madison and George Washington. He's one of the most influential men in this debate concerning the ratification of the Constitution. So anyway, eventually Maryland goes ahead and accepts this Constitution, and he has the privilege of announcing that, and Maryland becomes the 7th colony to ratify the Constitution, or to accept the Constitution, which was great news. So that's 1787. Well, the Constitution is accepted and approved 1788. It's established as the law of the land, and the new government is formed in 1789, and Daniel Carroll is elected in Maryland as a representative to go and participate in the first U.S. Congress. So he's a representative in the first U.S. Congress. The Congress met in New York City, so he went to New York City to serve in the first U.S. Congress, and was there to celebrate the election of George Washington as the first American president. And this took place in New York City. While he was there, now remember, this is Daniel Carroll, who was raised in Maryland, where his Catholic faith was oppressed by the Anglicans. Well, what do you think he focuses on in his work as a member of Congress? He focuses on the freedom of religion. And and making sure that the Establishment Clause in what would become the First Amendment is properly written. So he helps to establish freedom of religion in America. This Catholic from Maryland who grew up having to hide his Catholic education and travel overseas to receive a Catholic education, he now has the opportunity in 1789 to actually do the work, participate in the work, to put an end to that kind of political oppression of religion in America, which is pretty awesome. And this takes place in 1789. Now, going back to his brother John comes home from Europe after the Jesuit order is suppressed, and he basically goes back home to Maryland. While he's in Maryland, remember, he's a priest. He's an ordained priest, and he's now subject, because the Jesuit order has been suppressed, he's no longer accountable directly to the superior of his order and through him to the Pope himself. He's now a secular priest. He's accountable to the Vicar of London in England, who happens to be the Pope's vicar during this time of Protestant craziness in England. So now John Carroll is now accountable to the Vicar of London. But while he's in Maryland, he begins to organize the Catholics who are there, and obviously things are loosened up now that they've got this constitution and there's going to be freedom of religion. He starts organizing the Catholics in Maryland, and they organize Georgetown College, which would later become Georgetown University. So John Carroll, the brother of Daniel Carroll, organizes Georgetown College. He starts to take leadership of the American Catholics, and in 1789 or 1790, he is actually appointed Bishop of Baltimore, which is the first and only diocese in North America. And so John Carroll becomes the official leader of the Catholic Church in America. He goes on to become Archbishop John Carroll and establishes the Archdiocese of Baltimore in Maryland. That's where we get the Baltimore Council from and all that stuff, Baltimore Catechism. So he is the center of the Catholic Church in America. He is the leader of the Catholic Church in America, and his diocese is the whole entire North American continent. He's in charge of all Catholicism in America, which is pretty amazing. So whereas the suppression of the Jesuits was seen as a real setback, it ended up being the means by which he returned home and ended up becoming the leader of the Catholic Church in America. It's a pretty awesome story. But what's interesting is we've got these two brothers. We've got John Carroll, the bishop, and we've got Daniel Carroll, the politician. And these two brothers are, what I've come to appreciate and realize as I've studied their lives, and I haven't got much into John Carroll yet, but he's fascinating because I've been focused on Daniel Carroll. But it's a really beautiful model for us in 18th century America of what the life of the Catholic laity in America and what the life of the Catholic clergy in America are going to look like. John represents the Catholic clergy in America, which is a completely different animal, different world, nothing like Europe. And John Carroll is like the embodiment of the American Catholic spirit that's going to need to be cultivated. And then in Daniel Carroll, you've got this Catholic layman engaged in democratic society, in politics, in business, and so on. And these two men provide us with something that's like patron saints of American Catholicism for both the clergy and the laity. Now, they're not saints, so I'm not saying that, but you understand what I'm saying. They're role models for both clergy and laymen in America as Catholics. And as I said before, I've always been interested in understanding what the church was thinking while America was developing, whether the church was on board, whether the church thought it was really cool, or whether the church thought it was terrible. I've always wondered that, and I've wanted to get into that. And seeing Daniel and John Carroll, really opened my eyes to what Catholicism looked like and was going through in early America. Now, Daniel Carroll would go on to finish serving his, I think, 3 terms in the Congress. Eventually, they moved from New York City to Philadelphia. But in 1790, I guess 1791 or 1792, his 3rd term in Congress came to an end, and he was appointed by George Washington. Daniel Carroll was appointed commissioner of a project to go and locate the future home of the nation's capital. So Daniel Carroll was appointed as one of 3 men by George Washington to go and figure out where the capital should be built. And he chose, obviously, an area in the Maryland area where his family actually owned some of the land that ended up becoming the property used for Washington, D.C., given to the government for the nation's capital. And the establishment of Washington, D.C., which I think is kind of funny that it bears his initials, ended up being his last act of public service, and he died in 1796. So that was the life of this Catholic American, Daniel Carroll. And as I studied it and researched him and gathered all the information I could, I just found it to be a fascinating story because I had never heard of Daniel Carroll, had never studied any early Catholic influence in early America. Knew a little bit about John Carroll because in my book, Understanding Classical Catholic Education, I touched on the Catholic Church in America a little bit and talked about John Carroll, I think, but didn't know anything about Daniel Carroll. And by the time I was done writing this paper, I said, man, this is one of my favorite dudes in American history. And, I really came to admire Daniel Carroll. One thing that was really interesting to me, and I want to pull it up on my screen here if you just give me a second. One thing that was really interesting to me in studying this, I want to read this. Again, if you wonder, what did the early Catholics, what did the Catholics in America think about these people? Like, what did they think about George Washington? What did they think about these founding fathers? Were they really good men? Did the Catholics admire these men, or were they like obnoxious Protestants that the Catholics didn't like? Well, what's really interesting is that when George Washington is elected to serve as the first president, Daniel Carroll, John Carroll, Bishop John Carroll, and a couple other of the Catholics who were involved in the government presented an address to George Washington. And they expressed, extreme admiration for George Washington. They basically credited the success of the founding of the United States government to his personal character and work, claiming that it would have been impossible for there to be such unity among the colonies had not he been the embodiment of everything good about the American Constitution. So that was amazing to see how highly they thought of George Washington. And at the end, when they offer to pray for him, they say that they're going to pray that God would preserve his health and life because there is no other human benefit that could be asked for that is more necessary for the success of the American people. I mean, that's extraordinary praise for the man George Washington. And as I studied the life of John Adams earlier this semester, and sort of ran into George Washington a lot through John Adams, and now again getting to see George Washington looked at through the eyes of Catholics in early America. One thing that's clear is that George Washington is an extraordinary individual. It was said that in early America, every American family had a portrait of George Washington on their wall in the house. And I think that's something that I would encourage Catholics to consider. You need to learn about George Washington. the character of that man, what he did to help establish our country, because patriotism is a part of the Christian life, part of the incarnation, part of our life in this world. And George Washington is an extraordinary individual, the father of our country, and a man who was given the highest praise and honor by leading Catholics in America at the time. So I found that encouraging as an American to be able to put some pride in some of the founding fathers, in George Washington, in these men, Daniel Carroll, John Carroll, and I found it to be a really interesting history that I'm really just tapping into, but I'm glad I was able to sketch it out in this project, and I'm looking forward to dig more and more into it, because these are some really inspiring and excellent men, and there's lots of connections to the Classical Liberal Arts Academy and all these other things because of their connections to the Jesuits and the Ratio Studiorum and classical studies and all that. So it's really, really interesting stuff. I hope to introduce my own sons to some of these guys, and hopefully some other students in the academy. Coincidentally, right now we just found out that my daughter Elizabeth, Jonathan, my oldest son, he's finishing up his studies next semester, and he'll be going out as an officer into active duty service next year, so he's on his way out. And my daughter Elizabeth just earned an internship to intern with the Senate in Washington, D.C. next semester. So it's just pretty exciting that our family is getting connected to the nation's capital. My wife is studying at Catholic University of America. She'll also be in Washington, D.C., so I'll be there with her, and my daughter will be there. And my younger daughter, Mary, is actually going to room with Elizabeth while she's doing this internship. So just an interesting providential moment in my family life where for some reason we're wrapped up in American politics and life in Washington, D.C. So I don't know where any of that's headed, but just some interesting outcomes for a course that I decided to take because of my lack of experience in American history. And it's turned out to be a really, really interesting and edifying study, and I've found a couple of heroes to look back at. And I've got 2 more weeks left for this course, and I've got another one of these biographical sketches to do. And thankfully, there's a second Catholic man who was also a signer of the Constitution, Thomas Fitzsimmons from Pennsylvania. So over the next 2 weeks, I'm going to be finishing up my study of Daniel Carroll, get all this stuff turned in, and then get to work on the life of Thomas Fitzsimmons, who I know nothing about other than that he was a Catholic man in Pennsylvania who signed the Constitution. So I'm looking forward to learning about him as well. But I wanted to share the life of Daniel and John Carroll while it was all fresh in my head, because I'm finishing this paper tonight. But anyway, I hope that's helpful. Encourage you to look on the Academy website. If you go to the Classical Liberal Arts Academy website and in the search box, just search for Daniel Carroll. You'll see that there's a biography that I found written by a religious sister whose order I don't know. I didn't look into her very much, but she wrote a 180-page biography of Daniel Carroll, which if you'd like to get into this, you might want to take a look at. It's on the Academy website. But anyway, just some interesting American history for Catholics to think about. I found it very interesting and encouraging, to be honest. We beat up America so much and complain and criticize, but like Daniel Carroll said, there's never been a better form of government that anyone can name in the history of the world that we can look back at and say that it was a perpetually excellent form of government that allowed for change and other influences. We can point out a specific reign of a specific king and say, oh man, that's as good as it gets. But what happened the next generation? His heirs take over, they're nothing like him, and the place falls apart. So to hear a Catholic whose hands were in the pot, as it were, putting the Constitution together, say, there has never been a better form of government established, and then to see the man appointed as bishop by the church in America, agreeing and just being totally on board with the Constitution, and seeing them praising George Washington, and you know, getting to see all that just is like a breath of fresh air for an American Catholic. And there is a positive interpretation of American history that I think we as Catholics have to embrace, and a good place to start is the life of Daniel Carroll. So I hope that's helpful. Just interesting stuff that I wanted to share. Now I got to get back to work. God bless.